Hello and welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be talking about the 10 greatest jazz rock keyboard players of all time, I'm going to be ranking them from 10 to 1. Right, so this list was, to start off with, really easy. There's just obvious keyboardists that you're going to put on the list. Right, it's just a matter of getting them in order. So I wrote down the obvious list of jazz rock keyboard players, and I came up with 9. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good start. Number 10, I just could not come up with. It's as though once you get past the main guys, there's just hundreds and hundreds of keyboardists that have played in jazz rock fusion, which all have sort of the same sort of status. I thought, shall I put Jim Beard on, Stu Goldberg? Do I put like Mitchell Foreman on? You know, who do I pick? And none of them really shone out. And so I think this number 10 slot has been the hardest slot I've ever had to come up with any ranking video. All the rest was pretty easy. They're the obvious choices for jazz rock keyboard players. And the order was pretty obvious, I felt. You know, there's a few little, you know, niggles that we'll get to in a minute. So, this obviously, with all styles of music, you have the pioneers, and they're the ones that usually get the accolades and the rankings. Then towards the end of the 70s we have a whole ton of jazz rock keyboard players coming out, and they're all playing on a lot of very sort of middle of the road Fusac albums. There's just hundreds of them. They're very, very tasty players. I thought I needed someone to represent all of those, and the guy I've decided to put at number 10 is Jeff Lauber, right? And I've pulled out this album here, Jeff Lauber. This is called Water Sign. I think this came out early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. I'm not too sure. I'm not a massive expert. Yes, it's 1979. Jeff Lauber had a fusion band. This band, which was called the Jeff Lauber Fusion. First album came in 1975. They were really successful. They really represent that late 70s, you know, Fusac genre. These albums actually went on to chart. I think this got in the lower hundreds, but some of the later albums he did got into the sort of top 60 in the mainstream charts. Jeff Lauber's stuff is great. It is Fusac-y, it's funky. It's not the Mavish Nuptial or Returns Forever, but it doesn't really fall into the pitfalls of just being middle of the road, you know, unlistenable elevator music. He's a pretty funky player. And I thought I'd put him as number 10. His name crops up over and over again. He's played with lots of other people. I think he represents a certain type of keyboard playing that needs to be on the list, on our list of 10, you know, great fusion players. So that's why I put in Jeff Lauber. This is a great album. I do really like that album. Right. So the rest of these now, from now on, I just think are just, they're the gods, right? So at number 9, I haven't got a prop to hold up, right? And that's because this artist has actually been around for a lot less than the rest of the guys on this. Although she has been around for well over 20 years, and she has made a huge mark on jazz fusion. I believe she is possibly the greatest jazz fusion musician, you know, working at the moment on the contemporary scene, and that would be Hiromi. So Hiromi is a somewhere between Oscar Peterson and Herbie Hancock. She's an utter virtuoso on the piano and keyboards. She's really loved by the audiences. She's got a huge following, and she's also loved by the critics, which is really interesting because she has continually created jazz fusion. Right, now I think part of this is because she plays a lot of acoustic piano, but she does play synths as well. But I think because of the preponderance of piano, and for often working in a trio format, that's more palatable to the snobby jazz critics that often put other jazz fusion down. The stuff she has created is incredible, and she's worked with some of the greats. Her trio with Anthony Jackson and sorry, got something stuck in my throat. The trio she had with Anthony Jackson and Simon Phillips is just absolutely sublime. She's also worked with the incredible Dave Fazinski in a quartet. She has worked with Chick Correa. She's a fantastic musician. If you're into fusion, I would say that the albums she's made over the last 20 years just essential listening, that is where cutting edge fusion has been for the last 20 years or so. It's been with the great Hiromi at number 9. Right, who do we have at number 8? I have gone for Lyle Mays from the Pat Metheny group. Pat Metheny emerged in 1975 with his debut album with Jaco Pastorius and Bob Moses, and then he forms his own band and he brings in Lyle Mays on piano. But Lyle Mays doesn't just become a sideman to Pat Metheny, he becomes an essential composer and instrumentalist. At certain points, Pat Metheny has made duo albums with Lyle Mays, if you think of Wichita Falls. Lyle Mays is integral. He's an incredible soloist, an incredible composer. I feel that the Pat Metheny sound is really the Pat Metheny Lyle Mays sound. Pat Metheny's influence on jazz fusion is absolutely huge. He ushers in an almost alternative way of doing fusion in the late 70s, which takes over the sort of jazz rock of the Mahavishnu Orchestra and the funky jazz fusion of Headhunters and to some extent Weather Report, and he brings in another way of doing fusion. Of course, Lyle Mays is absolutely integral to that. He's also an incredible keyboard player, incredible soloist, and a really interesting use of synthesizers as well. So that's why I have Lyle Mays at number 8. Okay. At number 7, I have a true great, the late great Larry Young. Larry Young was the John Coltrane of the Hammond organ. Okay, he emerges in the 60s. He comes out of that organ trio thing that's going on with Jimmy Smith and Jack McDuff. But he doesn't play like those guys. He's got a much more spatial, modal, chordal harmony Coltrane approach. Now, those organ trios of the guitar, drums, organ, that's very influential on jazz fusion. So one of the pioneering jazz fusion groups, of course, is Tony Williams' Lifetime with Larry Young. But Larry Young at this time is also jamming with Hendrix. He appears on Devotion, which is another early fusion album. So Larry Young is a really, really important keyboardist, organist in the development of jazz fusion. On his own solo albums, he carves his own path and he makes some really creative, incredible solo albums throughout the 70s. They're not successful because they're pretty out there, but he is absolutely cutting edge. And throughout that, he does a number of sessions on some seminal jazz fusion albums. I was going to pull a Tony Williams Lifetime album out just to say, you know, this is the guy that was in that, but I pulled out this, you know, one of the greatest jazz fusion albums ever made. And of course, on here we have on Mating Drive, Larry Young on organ, and he appears on Prince of the Sea alongside Larry Coryell and Al Di Meola. So if you want to hear him in a proper fusion setting, check him out on this. Of course, Larry Young, after being one of the great keyboardists of the fusion era, succumbed to health issues and died in 1978, which I think has erased him a little bit, you know, in the history books. Although he is there because of his pioneering work. So that's who I have. I think it was number 7, wasn't it? Or was it number 6? I can't remember. I think it was number 6. Was the great Larry Young. Right, who do I have next at number... I'll just check. Shall we have a recap? This is for me. I've started doing this now. So, at number 10, Jeff Lauber. At number 9, we had Hiromi. At number 8, we had... Lyle Mays. Number 7, we had Larry Young. So at number 6, we have Keith Jarrett. Now, in terms of 20th century keyboard players, Keith Jarrett could be in the top 3. You know, his technical ability, his musicality, his originality, and his innovation places him very, very high on the list. For most of that time, he has ploughed a sort of acoustic jazz improvisational approach, right? But even within that, even within his jazz standard trio stuff that he's done with Jack LaJohnette and Gary Peacock, there's wisps of jazz fusion. right? But on albums like this is an out and out jazz fusion album. Now, of course, this is Keyboardists, and this is why he's dropped lower down the list. He hasn't been a keyboard experimenter in the same way as a George Duke or a Chick Corea. He has ploughed a path really exploring acoustic piano, although he has done albums on harpsichord and organ. I'd say Keith Jarrett ploughs his own path. But with the Miles Davis group, he contributes some of my favourite electric piano solos and keyboard solos in the history of jazz fusion. So this guy is a heavyweight. He's such a heavyweight musically that he's a heavyweight in just the sprinklings and touchings that he's had with jazz fusion. This album here, Belonging, is a fantastic album, and the opening track, Spiral Dance, is a fusion track, and it's one of the great fusion tracks. It made my top 20 fusion tracks of all time. So Keith Jarrett's an utter genius. He's an absolutely phenomenal keyboard player. I think the next sort of 5 we're going to be looking at, including Keith Jarrett, are so mind-bogglingly incredible on piano. Their abilities are so staggering. This is one of the things that fusion really produces. He's really, really incredible keyboard players. No other rock keyboardists or prog keyboards can compete against guys like Keith Jarrett or people like George Duke, who we have at number 5. George Duke emerged in the late 60s as a sort of post-Coltrane jazz pianist. He has a band with John LaPonte. Then he gets asked to do the gig with Frank Zappa. He actually joins Frank Zappa on trombone to start off with, and then he moves to keyboards. And I think in the early days with Zappa, he finds Zappa's approach quite weird. It's a new thing for him. And there's a wonderful interview where, you know, Zappa turns around to George Duke and says, you know, Coltrane and Miles, he goes, that's really heavy, but that's not the only way to be heavy. You know, and sometimes this weird comedy music and all this modern classical stuff and the fusion thing that Zappa brings to George Duke, I think really changed George Duke's approach. And of course, the George Duke band with Zappa is one of the great fusion bands and is perhaps Frank Zappa's greatest band. When he leaves that and he signs to NCPS, MPS, not MCPS, MPS, and starts making albums like these are some of the greatest fusion albums ever made. And they're funky, they're funny, they're virtuoso, they're really, it's like George Duke's take on Frank Zappa, which is like a very, very funky Frank Zappa. And also George Duke crops up on so many other albums. He's worked with Billy Cobham on albums like Crosswinds. He's absolutely incredible. I think when we come up with the sort of the big 5 jazz fusion keyboard players, I think George Duke comes off the worst, and I don't think that's fair. He was an absolute genius on the keyboards. He played such a huge part in creating the sound. He had a way of playing solos on Moog synths which was equal to Jan Hammer, who really dominates the sort of solo approach to fusion. But George Duke had his own way of doing it, which I think needs to be commended. So there we have at number 5, George Duke. Right. So who have we got at number 4? Herbie Hancock. Right. This is how great this list is. Is that Herbie Hancock comes in at number 4. An absolute pioneer of jazz fusion keyboard playing, an absolute pioneer of jazz playing, a guy that has had hit records, sold millions of albums, has made some of the most classic jazz fusion tunes, like on this album Chameleon, which is like is almost like a jazz standard now. Has pioneered synth playing, electric piano playing, has really single-handedly invented the funky side of fusion. This guy comes in at number 4. Right, this is the quality of the players. This is a genius. I mean, really, these last 4, even 5, even including George Duke, they should be all combined number 1. I really can't split them apart. I think the reason why is just the influence on fusion. So Herbie Hancock has had a huge influence on fusion. This is so hard to explain, but perhaps not as great an influence on fusion as the guys that are above him. Herbie Hancock hasn't really pursued the jazz rock route. He hasn't got into electric guitars, the bombast of Return to Forever and Mavish Nuxtra. He hasn't explored quite the range of keyboard playing as Joe Zawinul has with Weather Report. So that's where he's at number 4. It doesn't take anything away from him. At number 3, one of the greatest keyboardists of all time again, I've got Chick Corea. I pulled out Touchstone because this album seems to represent all the different things that Chick Corea did. I was going through my albums, all the Chick Corea albums, and as you can see behind me, I've got there. Where is it? There. That's a solo improvised acoustic piano album. Chick Corea was there before Keith Jarrett doing that stuff. I've got free jazz albums by him. I've got classical albums by him. I've got duo albums. I've got him playing jazz standards. I've got him playing almost like pop stuff. I've got him playing bombastic jazz fusion with Return to Forever. I've got him playing Latin music. On this album, he doesn't do all of that, but he does a lot of that. It's a nice representation of what Chick Corea does, with even a cheeky Return to Forever track thrown in on the opening. Compadres on side 2. Chick Corea, my God, what can I say about this guy? Chick Corea's influence on jazz fusion is huge. He's late to the party though. He doesn't really get to jazz fusion until 1973. Before then, he's exploring free jazz with the Miles Davis Group and his own band Circle, and then he's a pioneer of Latin jazz with the first version of Return to Forever. But in 1973, after Hear the Mavish Nuxtra, he plugs in with the Return to Forever. But he makes his mark, and the reason why he makes his mark is because of those influences coming from Spanish music and flamenco, and also his modern classical influence. So Return to Forever is a lot more orchestrated, a lot more compositional than the Mavish Nuxtra, and that's why he's here. I don't think he's quite the pioneer on synthesizers as the next 2 guys, which is I think why they've scored so high. Is their ability to really create the sound of jazz rock keyboard playing. So at number 2, we have the absolutely mighty Joe Zawinul. Joe Zawinul, who was originally from Austria, grew up in the Second World War, witnessed a lot of quite horrendous things, which gave him a grit and determinism that was quite unique in jazz fusion. He's older than a lot of the other guys I've spoken about. And so he's had a longer career before he gets to jazz fusion. He's playing with Cannonball Adderley throughout the 60s, and he's playing straight jazz. He proves himself as being one of the greatest straight jazz pianists before he even gets to fusion. He gets to fusion because his composition is playing so good that Miles Davis decides to use one of his compositions on In a Silent Way that basically invents jazz fusion. Not quite, but he's there right from the start. And he starts to explore his own line with Weather Report, which actually starts off really experimenting with the ideas that Miles is experimenting with on In a Silent Way and Bitches Brew. And Weather Report slowly moves down its own path, which is sort of time no changes, free jazz, without focused soloing. His electric piano playing is absolutely gorgeous. He's picked this up from playing with Cannonball Adderley. Cannonball Adderley is a pretty important group in terms of the development of jazz fusion. Because Cannonball Adderley was exploring soul jazz. And eventually with Weather Report, he creates an orchestrated, studio-based way of using keyboards. It's highly influential. So that's why we've got this guy at number 2. So important. Joe Zawinul at number 2, but I think you know who I'm going to put at number 1. It is, of course, Jan Hammer. Because Jan Hammer is the guy that basically creates jazz fusion, keyboard playing for me. If I go and see a jazz fusion group and the guy starts taking a solo, you know he's going to have a monophonic, sort of square, sawtooth wave, Moog sound running through a distortion unit, maybe with a bit of delay, and he's going to be using the pitch wheel to create bends that sound like a guitarist, or maybe even an Indian classical musician, which is what Jan Hammer was trying to actually emulate when he did that. This is one of the greatest jazz fusions ever made, albums ever made, with some of the greatest jazz fusion keyboard playing. And also, this guy's there right from the start. Here is Jan Hammer with Jeremy Steig, right back from 1970s on a pioneering jazz fusion album. He does everything, he ticks the box, he's an absolute utter virtuoso. Often I think he hides his virtuosity, you're not aware of what he can do, but you've got to remember, before he was playing the Mavish Nocturne, Jan Hammer was playing piano for Sarah Vaughan, right? You have to be a jazz virtuoso to that, and of course he was, like Joe Zawinul. You know, he is another Eastern European, you know, immigrant to America. You know, he's had to fight his way there. It's quite interesting that the guys at the top have come from that. Anyway, that's my list of the 10 greatest jazz fusion keyboardists rank. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked it, then please like the video. If you've got your own comments to put them in down below. As I keep saying, this is my list. It's not your list. It's my list. It's pretty subjective. If you want to support me in what I do, then, you know, become a Patreon. There's like 50 videos over on Patreon now, exploring all sorts of esoteric subjects, which I'm sure you'll enjoy. But more importantly, you know, I love doing this, and if I can get a little bit of money to stop going out into the world and trying to make money by playing the drums or teaching music, and I can sit and do this, the more I can do this, the better, because I absolutely love doing this, and I hope you do too, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you on the next one. Thank you very much. Goodbye.